Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar. You are all very, very welcome. We will kick off shortly. It's always nice to know where people are joining from in the world as you log on. I am in rainy London at the moment. Jessie, where are you?
I'm in New York City.
Better weather than here.
Yes, definitely. It's lovely. Sorry.
I know, very, very jealous. Well, everyone, you are welcome here. My name is Kelly McGrath-Smith. For anyone who might be new to Hire, we are a global community of internal TA and HR folks. So we've got over 10,000 members at the moment. We have a Slack community group, and we've got lots of amazing people in the group, as well as sub-interest groups if you're interested in stuff in HR, sourcing. So do feel free to come and join us if you're not already a member. So I've just popped the link below for anyone who might be new. So it is hirehq.com. And I guess to give you like a little bit of a background to Hire, we kind of see ourselves as like the hive mind of global TA, and we're really on a mission to really help up level and give back to the industry. And part of that mission is bringing you these fantastic weekly webinars that we host here on LinkedIn Live. And today, very excitingly, and I think Jessica was definitely a highly requested guest, but I'm just joined by Jessica Zwaan, who will be leading today's webinar. And we'll be talking about how to tackle compensation and performance with a product thinking approach, and talking through insights, practical methods from Jessie's book, Built for People, as well as talking through her 3-part blog series as well. So very excited to have Jessie here. Jessie, I'll hand over to you for a bit of an introduction for anyone who might not know you, although I know you're very well known in our TA and HR industry.
Oh God, that makes me feel awkward. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm getting off the back end of being quite sick, so I'm not actually my usual very bubbly self today, and I'm going to be a little rusty, but I appreciate your patience with me, and hopefully we still get something out of it. You're going to hear a lot of rustling, and that's because I've got some cough drops, got some things around, and I may occasionally just need to get some of that stuff. But I'm really excited to chat through today's topic. Are you okay for me just to kick off, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only thing I would say to folks joining is you are able to drop in questions and comments in our little chat box. So feel free to pop in any messages as we go, but we'll also have time at the end for a Q&A as well. So yeah, hand over to you.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, I would love the comments. I think the comments are very helpful for me. I'm the kind of person that needs to be able to see people's faces. Obviously, that's not an option today. I can see Kelly's beautiful face, but being able to see what you guys are saying really helps me. Because I'm not going to be doing a kind of presentation at you so much. I'm going to talk you through some of the stuff I've recently posted. And I've received a lot of questions in DM. I get a lot of LinkedIn messages, and a lot of emails and website reach outs asking very often the same kinds of questions. So I figured what might be a useful thing today is to do a bit of an FAQ from the content I've posted recently. And then, of course, answer some questions that people may post to me in the comments, and talk you through a little bit about the performance and compensation pieces I've been writing lately, and where they've come from and what they mean, and how to kind of make them your own. So performance and compensation. So this is a topic that I think is usually I think considered fairly painful by a lot of people. It's one of those pieces where I've written quite a bit before in the past about making a compensation philosophy just generally from scratch, and in a lot of ways I actually think that's much easier, because what you're basically doing there is you're just saying, if I'm bringing someone into our team, doing a first-time assessment of them during a recruitment process, how much are going to pay them? A very helpful part of that process is often someone will be very open with you about what they would like for their salary. And you, of course, should reciprocate, I think, and have a very transparent process around how you select a salary. But that process kind of happens once, and then somebody becomes embedded into your organization. So they're working for you for a year or more. And then the next question becomes, okay, great, well, this person's been doing a good job of their job, and all this stuff has happened. We've had market changes. This person is performing well, but maybe not the best out of their peers. Maybe they are performing the best out of their peers. What does that mean? How do we adjust their compensation based on these changes that have happened over the course of the last couple of months or years. And this is where things I think actually start getting really difficult, because it's no longer a single once-off assessment of their skills. It's now this kind of rolling discussion. And many businesses have processes like you must already be showing 75 or 85% of the competencies for your next level before you're ready for promotion. Well, of course, some people find that inherently a little unfair. They're having to perform essentially at the next level without being paid for it for a year. Is that really how you want to be creating your compensation framework? And I agree with those criticisms. I think actually it's a very fair point. And if a company is going to be taking that approach, then you do need to be thinking fairly actively about how do you have this kind of rolling performance-based compensation changes that take all those things into account. Great. So what I have written over the last couple of months, I think the first one I wrote in April, is a kind of 3-step process to think about the 3 parts of performance and compensation. So part 1 is all around how to measure performance and how important it is to have some kind of quantifiable measure of what performance looks like in your organization. Part 2 is about calibration, what a calibration process is all about. And part 3 is basically putting your money where your mouth is and making some kind of algorithm that connects both performance and compensation. So thank you, Kelly, for sharing part 1. I'm going to open it up now. I'm not going to be reading out my blog because that's insane, but what I'm going to do is kind of talk you through the main points that we talked through. So the main piece of this whole blog post, and it goes on and on and on, is this, right? It's this idea of some kind of measure for performance. A lot of businesses use a McKinsey 9-box grid. This is kind of a riff on that. Rather than starting down in the bottom left-hand corner, you're starting in the middle, perfectly aligned. Some businesses just use a simple 1 to 5 scale. Some businesses use a range of 1 to 5 scales. Like how do you perform on values? How do you perform on this and that and that? And then it creates a kind of decimal point number or some kind of score. I personally don't really mind what you pick. This at Whereby was built through a process of pretty rigorous user research. We did a lot of user research interviews with our team, and we also did quite a lot of research of what was working in other businesses. And we discovered that this kind of perfectly aligned in the center was really beneficial for both managers and employees who struggled with the idea of kind of starting from the bottom and moving upwards. And we actually found a lot of people were being put at perfectly aligned when they actually weren't really in that space genuinely when you ask them descriptions of that person. So we found that this was a better way to get a more accurate and kind of more representative description of how people felt about their performance. So we have this perfectly aligned box, and then we have one axis, which is literally just how somebody is performing based on their competency framework. So we have a thing that we've created called Take Flight, which is basically a leveling framework, a progression framework. I am not a huge fan of very detailed progression frameworks. I think having a very generic progression framework for each level is very beneficial, and then a set of competencies that are associated with that. So that's what we have at Whereby. Teams have then gone on and made things slightly more niche for themselves, like the engineering team, for example, but we don't really kind of generally endorse those as being a central thing. Managers can use them, but HR, for example, the people team doesn't actually build them or maintain them. We just maintain the generic one. So that's what we have here, this axis of performing or underperforming. So how well is someone performing on this spectrum according to the progression framework that we have built for their level? So if someone's a level 1, one of their expectations, for example, would be to contribute to goal setting, right? How well are they doing that? Are they above and beyond in their examples, or are they underperforming in their contributions? And then the second axis that we have here is growth, active growth or passive growth. The reason Whereby has selected this as their second axis, and I kind of talk about the fact that you can kind of use anything. I think anything within reason, anything that you feel like is moving your people aspirationally towards a direction you believe is very culturally and strategically aligned with you. We've used this because Whereby is a fully distributed company, right? We have people all over the world. And due to that, very often people's managers won't even be in the same time zone as them. And we also have a thing called hours agnostic, which is a policy that Anybody can work any hours they want. You're basically in charge of your own hour distribution. But what is requested of you is that you behave like a grown-up, essentially. Do whatever's in the best interest of Whereby. If your bank called you and said their only mortgage appointment they had was 7 a.m. in the morning and you needed to get a mortgage appointment, you would wake up at 5 in the morning and go to your mortgage appointment at 7. You wouldn't want to do it every day. I think that's fair enough. But it's the same as at Whereby. Every now and then you may have a meeting at 7 a.m. Every now and then you might have a meeting at 9 p.m. But the majority of the time, you're the person kind of dictating how your calendar should run and making adjustments for that. Now, the combination of fully distributed and hours agnostic means that very often you are left to your own devices to make decisions, to pursue growth, to discuss things with others asynchronously, and get involved in how you generate your opinions about things. And because of that, we have realized fairly early on in the time that I started working at Whereby that you will not succeed in our company if you need somebody else's constant support and direction to grow as an individual. So we have this axis here called active growth, and we have a whole page of documentation about how to think about active growth and what it means. But essentially what this is somebody is independent, consistent, and effective in terms of their growth. So independent means they are going out by themselves and making decisions around what they need to do to achieve growth. So for example, if somebody gave me feedback saying, you aren't very good at soliciting feedback. You do things and then you charge on to the next thing. You don't ask others how that work impacted them. I would say, okay, great. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a feedback form and add it into my Slack profile and add it into my email address and make sure every single time I finish something, I always send that feedback form out. That's an independent decision. I've independently decided I'm going to solicit feedback more actively. The next thing is consistent. So if I can't just send that feedback form out once at the end of my next project and say, well, I went and got the feedback you asked me for. I need to be doing it consistently and potentially in like consistently different ways as well. And then finally, it has to be effective. And that means that I have to be able to actually be getting something out of that. So just sending out a feedback form to people doesn't mean I'm better at soliciting feedback. It just means that I'm asking for it. So an example of effectively soliciting feedback would be I sent a feedback form out every single time I finished a project. I got consistent feedback. I took that feedback on board and then messaged everybody afterwards and said, hey, thank you for this feedback about the fact that I struggle to submit things on time. Next time I'm going to make sure I do that. And then I go through and make sure that that happens, right? So you see some kind of effective outcome. Those things together are an example of someone very active in their growth at Whereby. So if someone was very active in their growth, they are independent, consistent, and effective. And someone that was passive in their growth would require, maybe they're still growing. That's definitely not something that we don't believe. But it may be somebody that is maybe growing with a bit more assistance from somebody else, maybe not quite super effectively all the time, but they're trying different things, but not quite working out how it works for them. Or maybe they're just slightly inconsistent about their approach. And also that's actually okay. Sometimes people go through those phases in their lives, and that doesn't mean that you're not achieving at Whereby. You're going to, for example, lose out in a performance review cycle necessarily, but it does mean that you'll be placed down in the persisting or stalled space. So that is our two axes, right? I've also worked with businesses that just had pure OKRs as one of their axes. Obviously, a classic one is potential, and how do you measure potential is difficult, but how do you measure growth is a similar question. I think you need to be very consistent and just create some kind of form. One of the questions, one of the, I guess, criticisms I've had before, where I helped a business use an axis that was just OKR achievement. So like 100% OKR achievement, 0% OKR achievement, let's just say. I think it was more like 80 to 10 or something. But when you're using OKRs to directly correlate into performance, one of the cautions I would have is OKRs can be really complicated. Goals are also the same kind of thing. So using OKRs or goals or KPIs or something like that, I would just be cautious. Make sure that you're doing a really good job of keeping those clean, having them well set, having people have real buy-in into what those things are, and also making sure that you aren't pivoting throughout the quarter. People will get really, really frustrated if they cannot demonstrate performance according to your framework, because goals are part of that. So the company I worked with that ended up using their OKRs as part of this were, in my opinion, probably one of the best in class companies in terms of how they set OKRs. They were a very, very logical kind of output-based business. And that all really helped them. Now, if you are a business that isn't extremely like output based, very like clerical in some form, you may struggle to do that. So I would say, think long and hard about how you want to incorporate OKRs into this. Maybe OKRs achievement is one portion of your progression framework. For example, like consistent achievement of your OKRs, like it means that you're good at setting your roadmap and you're good at giving feedback on goal setting, for example, which maybe just goes into performance rather than another axes. And that's one of the questions I actually get a lot, right? So what should this other axis be? Doesn't really matter. It matters about what you want your people to be moving towards. So that's how Whereby builds ours, but there are a lot of other different ways, like I mentioned. And what we've actually done is we've also created an even deeper back end here, which is slightly too small for you to see. There we go. So even deeper back end. So this is actually what managers see. So employees can see this, like it's visible on the page. It's not like the front and center view. And the reason we've actually done this is we have two mottos in the people and operations teams at Whereby. One is to do everything in mind of the mission. So we're really, really focused on our company mission and achieving that. And the second thing, rather selfishly, but effectively, is to achieve everything through others. We don't build anything that requires the people or the operations team to run it in order for it to be successful. And the reason for that is our job is not to run these processes a lot of the time. Managers should be doing it. And if managers can't understand what they're doing and don't see the value in these tools, then they just won't interact with them. And I'm sure everyone here on this webinar has had similar experiences where they've built something or even used something that maybe a HR team or a finance team or an operations team has built, and you find yourself kind of scratching your head saying, this is really difficult, I don't really understand what this is for, I don't get how this works, or feeling like you need somebody else to help you use it. This is there to try and help our managers feel like they understand a little more what they need to do with this tool, right? So you have this kind of nice one that we share out to the team to help them, give them a broad understanding of where they may be placed in our progression framework or our performance framework. And then this one goes to managers to say, okay, great. So this is where your team are broadly. Of course, people are kind of roughly within these spaces. But what does this mean for you as a manager? What should you do here? Should you think about next steps for them? Should you start talking about promotion? Should you maybe manage their workload? Maybe they're slightly overloaded and that's the reason they can't grow. Someone's really high performing but not actively growing at all. There's something going on there, right? So this gives a little direction for you as a manager to take before you start coming to the people team or before you go to your manager and escalate the issue and start saying, okay, what should I do now? So this is the one that our managers see. And I think building these two has been really helpful for us. This has definitely given a lot of soft guidance to our managerial folks to understand kind of what to do with performance. But these two things are still, as you can notice, like a little touchy-feely. They're not super quantifiable. You're starting to see some numbers here, though. You've got 1, 2, 1, 2, negative, negative. But what does that mean? So this is where the kind of intersection of compensation performance starts getting a little bit more intermeshed, right? So performance is this nebulous thing. It changes all the time. People are kind of one day to the next performing incredibly, and then some days having a rough day. I mean, I've been sick for the last few days, so I'm sure Chris and Kelly and the rest of the team are about ready to wring my neck. I've been barely present, right? And that's not because I'm underperforming. It's because, I haven't been on my ball the last couple of days. I've been sick. That happens. So how can you possibly say, well, one day to the next, I'm going to be judging someone's performance and then start paying them according to that? We all know that that's a really difficult thing to do. So how do you use a tool like this that maybe is saying at the moment somebody's down here, but really most of the time they're up here? Like, how do you use this tool to kind of frame performance? What we've built at Whereby is a kind of system that uses this, or rather this kind of tool that our team interface with, and turns it into a very quantifiable number, just a simple number. And that is actually this, which looks, now we're getting ugly because now I'm the person designing these, not the designer anymore. And now I'm the one building them in Excel, right? What this is essentially the mapping out of those positions on that grid, and placing them, just giving them a number. These numbers don't actually really mean anything. They're just an identifier for each of these spaces. We can actually move these numbers around. So when we get to the part 3, I can talk a little bit about what we may do there in order to change the values of performance outcomes. But what we do is we give each of those spots in the grid a number, some kind of identifier, right? So if you are overperforming and stable in your growth, you are a number 2. If you are exceeding expectations and really passive in your growth, that overworked maybe space I spoke about before, you're also a number 2. So you can see here that there's like quite a few numbers that kind of overlap and interlace with each other. So basically what this is trying to do is to take this much more human face of performance and turn it into something that an algorithm or a spreadsheet can understand. You can have a conversation with somebody about this, about their performance on a daily basis, a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, a yearly basis, and it can feel human, it can feel nuanced, it can feel like it's giving you some kind of sense of direction about where to push them in their careers or where you may want to guide them. But really what I need for compensation is literally just a figure to put in my spreadsheet to figure out how much do I pay this person compared to somebody else in a different place of the performance grid. So that is part 1. I'm going to move over to part 2 unless anyone has any questions about part 1. You can always jump back. I asked for comments and I've just got this sad comment box of no one speaking to me, Kelly.
We also have a lag though, because we're like 30 seconds behind. I was going to say we're 30 seconds in the future. I guess we are a little bit. But yeah, I mean, people can jump in at any point with comments as well. So I think it's always nice to have these webinars interactive. And I think the joy of watching them live, because obviously this will also be a replay for people to watch forever and whenever they want. But watching it live, you get to actually ask your question and have your input, which, you know, is always a huge bonus because you don't often have these opportunities to jump in yourself with something directly.
Yes. Well, we're over to part 2. I think we're ready to go into the next bit. Okay. So you'll notice that throughout this, it starts getting these conversations will start getting more and more detailed and a little bit more kind of numeric. Oh, hi everybody! I've got Ali commenting in. Hi, nice to see you. Okay, fine. Now I've got my one little moment of hi everybody. Okay, we do have one question. How do you assign values in the books? So for us, values are part of performance. So in our performance framework and our take flight, I'll share that because I have got it open so I can do it. So actually, let me just share in the comments. Oh, I can't put anything in the comments, can I?
No, but I can because I've got my LinkedIn open on the other page. So
great. I'll share this with you. That's right. You said this before. I was listening. My brain is just dead. Okay, I've just sent Kelly a page from Whereby, which is our performance. This is Whereby's performance snapshot, which is what I've been showing you. But we also have our take flight progression framework. And within the framework, one of the elements of performance is to perform your duties according to our values, with behaviors according to our values, right? So we'll have examples of what that needs to look like. We have our values, behaviors clearly written out, and that is an expectation that you talk about those things in the calibration, which is what we're going to talk about now. So I can talk a little bit about how that all works. So what is a calibration? A calibration is a super exhausting, long process that takes hours to do. But at the moment, there's no other way to do it. You have to just get together in a room and have a calibration discussion. A calibration discussion is essentially trying to get on the same page all of your managers, everyone that leads a team, about what performance needs to look like. So it needs to be evidence-based, it needs to be engaged, and it needs to be maybe even a little bit antagonistic. You need to kind of be pushing each other, like positively, right? Like constructively. But that's kind of the place it needs to be at. Everyone has to be very, very present. We have this kind of little cycle. This looks really detailed, but this is basically what we do. So we have 4 quarters of the year, same as everybody else, although I have worked in businesses that have done thirds before that worked really effectively as well. And in each of these quarters, we set up a plan, deploy, and a retro. So the retro period goes on the same time as the end of the deployment, but otherwise every single quarter we have the exact same process. Plan at the beginning, deploy during the quarter, retro at the end. Done. We also have calibration processes. So we have 2 kind of big calibration processes that happen at Whereby, but we actually technically have 3. So we have 2 formal ones that happen, and then we have this kind of third soft calibration that happens during the middle of the year. What we do is we have a calibration that happens in Q4, and that calibration is the one that we use to do all of our forecasting for the next year. So we get together and we talk about everyone's performance, we calibrate our understanding of performance, and it's usually in like kind of October time, and then we'll do a second one in February. And then the one in February is the official big one where everybody's changes get rolled out. We do all of the compensation changes in Q1, making sure our compensation framework's up to date and all of our market changes have been deployed. And then we actually have this third soft period. So between May and September, anyone in our company, they themselves or their manager, can say this person's ready to have a conversation about their performance. That may mean just a pay change. It may mean a promotion or some kind of progression for them. Or it could actually mean something else. It could mean this person's struggling with their performance and we want to have a really serious conversation about that. Now, those conversations happen between May and September because we've just done a big calibration process, as we said, in February. So those kind of changes hit March, April. There's no point generally really us having like another calibration suddenly a month later. Like if nothing was highlighted in the previous calibration, it's more of a question about how effectively did that manager calibrate then. And then the same is true in October, right? We close the window in September and then we open the new window in October. During that period, if you're on one of the soft calibrations, you will not be in a room doing a full calibration with all the other managers. But what will be expected to happen is we will gather a random selection of managers who will sit in a room and calibrate that one person with you according to the previous calibrations that they've been involved in. So they have the memory of that, they have all the evidence, and we have that conversation again, make sure they're on the same page about where you've placed your team members' performance, and then the pay change is rolled out the exact same as it was in Q1, if that's when the last changes happened. So the biggest and most difficult part of this process is the calibration process. It is it's an intense meeting. It's an expensive meeting. And I think a lot of teams really struggle with it because they haven't quite nailed how to make it work really effectively. So I've given some like structure here about like how many managers should be in each, how many teams should be in each of these ones. So you can see here there's like a bit of a range, but 5 managers, 15 teams is about right, and how long they take. And they take hours, honestly, really long time. But what is happening in a calibration process? So basically in a calibration, remember that that kind of red and green little box I showed you before with all of the different positions on the grids? Everybody in the team will place their team members into that grid and then give evidence based on both of those two axes. So for example, performance, this person was overperforming consistently against their role. These are all the behaviors they showed. These are all the things they did according to the values in the way that they performed their behaviors. These are the outcomes. These are the goals they achieved, whatever it needs to be. And the same is true for active growth, right? The active growth piece detailed, was it consistent? Was it effective? Was it independent? Detail of those pieces out. And they sit in a room. And as you can see here, you can see this little bell curve. So we've looked here between all of the men versus all of the women. Where do they fall on this bell curve of data that I've got here? So that we can say like, oh, interesting. It looks like obviously in this is all dummy data, by the way. In this dummy data, there's a lot more men than women. What does that mean for the distribution? Let's have a conversation about it. But the other thing we do is we literally talk through every single individual. Every single individual has a discussion. So this is a kind of general breakdown of how we do it. Now, this is a place I get a lot of questions about because very often one of the pushbacks you get from management is this is a really expensive meeting. I already know how everyone's performing. I don't have the time to come into this meeting. It's there for 2 hours talking about these things. I cannot stress how valuable this is. There's a bit of research that talks about the fact that people don't really learn from their own manager. So I can anecdotally tell you this, like I've had a lot of fantastic managers in my time who've given me really good feedback and showed me the places I need to improve. But I very often haven't been directly learning off them because I'm not always seeing what I'm expected to do at my level off of them, right? The place you learn the most is by seeing really great peers do a fantastic job of their job. That's when you start understanding like, oh, that's what is expected of a VP, or that's what's expected of a lead. And seeing them in action is actually so valuable. And that's really what a calibration is also there. It kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, right? You get into a room with all of the other managers. Maybe it's a product and engineering calibration. So you've got 2 engineering managers, a product leader, and a design leader. Everyone's there and they're talking about their own team. Like, this is all my level 3s. This is what I expect of them. This is how they're performing against those expectations. You'll see one manager do a really good job of giving really effective feedback, very clear about their examples, actually showing clear understanding of where their own biases begin and end, or making attempts to do that. And then you can also see other managers who struggle. They say things like, yeah, they're a great communicator and they've done a really nice job this quarter. Well, what does that mean? Like, and you see them digging into asking questions. And that's when you get to have a better understanding of like what good performance looks like as a manager, but also what good performance looks like in your own business, right? So the way that we kind of structure it is we first go through 5 minutes reading a little bit about performance review bias. Culture Amp has this really nice little blog. I really like using this one because it's really simple to understand. I think everyone can kind of bite into it, review it, make sure no one has any questions, and we move on. Bias is really present in all of these conversations. I will say until somebody invents some magical way to calibrate automatically, you're going to have to deal with the fact that there is sometimes a valuable recency bias or a valuable kind of bias of who is closest to you, like how far away this person is from you. Those things sometimes are beneficial because it helps you protect your team, but it also can be a negative thing, obviously, because it can be a blind spot. 10 minutes quickly read through the calibration document. So that is the spreadsheet. I've built a simple template in the bottom of this blog, and it's really easy for you just to spend 10 minutes quickly reading through people's feedback, making sure you're on the same page about it. Then someone will read aloud the golden rules of calibration. This doesn't need to be the HR team. It doesn't need to be the most senior person in the room. Nominate somebody to read through those golden rules, which I've got them below, and then structure some kind of set of however you want to run your calibration. I've given my example of how I like to do it. We'll do that first, and then I'll talk about the golden rules. The way that I like to run the calibrations is first I like to talk through a couple of examples of just clear, non-controversial overperformance, right? It's always a nice place to start there because it's usually fairly easy to evidence. There's like usually a lot of evidence if someone's a strong performer. And very often, very strong performers are relatively non-controversial. Their kind of halo effect is felt fairly broadly, so everyone kind of understands what that needs to look like. Of course, there may be some controversy, and that's fine. You can address those when they come up. But I find it's easy to start there because that's generally where there's most alignment, and then you move down. So then the next thing to do is to then look at your kind of bubble population, which is what we call it, which is those people that are in this kind of perfectly aligned area that could be overperformers, maybe a manager struggling to decide where to put them, and have a conversation about those people. And then continue doing that flow, right? So in that process, that is actually where this bubble population, these people that you haven't quite put in over or underperformance, that's where the richest conversation happens. Because at that point, that is where you're really talking about the nuance of examples. So someone may say, well, I think this person's a really fantastic example of a level 4 because they asked for these resources for their quarterly planning, and they used all the resources effectively, and they hit their goal on time. And someone else says, well, isn't that actually an example of level 5? Because they were asking for resources that weren't just financial, but also headcount. Oh, interesting. I didn't think about that. Does anyone else in your team ask for both of those two things? Well, no, they're like only level 5s. So maybe they are actually overperforming. Interesting, right? And that's where these conversations start kind of getting into the nitty gritty of things. Now, then you do that kind of 1 to 3 times for the underperforming population. So you kind of go through here a couple of times and discuss any outliers at that point. That is basically the whole process, right? You should be able to get through that whole time. At the very end, you do this aggregate bias check, which is to look at everybody in the whole population on some kind of distribution curve and say, does anything look really wonky here? Does it look like we're over calibrating women negatively, or does it look like I like to look at tenure, level, team, gender, and any other protected characteristic that you have to file. But of course, just be cautious of the fact that you may not have lots of stats depending how big your team is. If you've only got a team of 4 people in the engineering team who are gender diverse, then it's very difficult to say like, oh, well, we've clearly seen some kind of outlier here. Like, you're better off looking at those people individually and really making sure you're taking it through that with a fine-tooth comb. So that's the process of the calibration exercise. It's a fairly simple process, but what it really requires is a very clear understanding of what the golden rules of calibration are. I'm not going to read through this whole thing. They're all written out here, obviously. But one of the most important things I think in this is that the objective of a calibration meeting is this first one, is not to tell other managers to move their team's performance. It is not for you to sit in the room and say, I disagree with where you've placed your team. I think you should move them to underperforming. That's the manager's decision to make. It is for you as a group of managers to feel like you have aligned understanding of what good and great and not great performance looks like. If you have a good understanding of that chart that I created before, the performance snapshot or whatever it is you're using, like a 1 to 5 rating or a 9-box grid, if you all have a clear understanding of that, you should ostensibly be able to place your team effectively in the same kinds of places based on the same kinds of evidence. So if I gave you just a sheet of evidence of my team, you should be able to place them in pretty much the exact same place I've placed them, more or less, right? That's the aim. It's not about telling people to move their teams. And of course, sometimes the outcome is people will move them. Sometimes they move them positively, sometimes they move them negatively. But what it's there to do is to make sure that you have a shared understanding of what good performance looks like and be able to blind place anyone in the team based on really good quality evidence. Now, there's a kind of like sub-context to this, which is if you see another manager do a bad job of placing someone in the performance framework because they're being obtuse or they don't seem to fully understand it, which is an expectation of a manager level, then that's completely your prerogative to say that you don't believe they are meeting their expectations as a manager, but you aren't in a place to tell them to start moving people around, right? That's something you should share with their manager. So because of that, one of the other outcomes here is that, if you're overruling, you do it with evidence. And also one of the most important things for us is that this is actually almost a terminable offense, in my opinion. If a manager goes back to the calibration room or goes back to their employees and tries to pass the buck or say things like, the calibration room said this, or here's what other people said about you, but I really wanted to place you here, that is completely non-tolerated. That is completely unacceptable. It is a manager's responsibility to both confidently place their team, have clear evidence, and be able to stand by the evidence of whatever came out of that calibration, right? If managers cannot do that, then they're failing their responsibilities as a manager, and that is, like I said, it's a disciplinary action on behalf of our business, and we take that very seriously. Of course, we have had examples, and I'm sure many companies have, where a manager's gone out of a room and said, oh, I really wanted to get you the promotion, but I was told I wasn't allowed to do that. That's not something that happens at Whereby. It doesn't exist. So managers are essentially told that if they do behave that way, then that is absolutely unacceptable. Great. And then the rest of that is just talking about the idea of being present and being able to share good feedback. I would say that the way that we frame our calibrations broadly at Whereby is that you should we say disengage at your own peril, essentially. If you're a manager that wants to show up and just say their 2 bits and leave, and you aren't present for the questions you're being asked or the questions that are being asked, you may be open to ask to others, they are generally noticed and other managers will comment on them. And calibration is kind of seen as a sacred time where managers are really able to have these deep conversations about their team's performance. And also, because of part 3, which we'll get to in just a moment, your team takes it really seriously because they know that conversation directly correlates with their compensation. Okay, are there any questions about calibration while I just briefly cough and have a cough drop?
Yes, have a cough drop. I feel like you are just talking through so much amazing information, and I can't believe you're doing it while you've been under the weather. But we just had a comment from Marion saying, fully agree, yes. And that was to your point around leaders and managers completely owning whatever decision comes out of the room as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that sometimes gets kind of after the calibration bit gets forgotten a little. So I do really, I really strongly believe that the behavior that manager comes into this and comes out of it with dictates how seriously their team takes it as well, right? Okay, I'm going to talk about the final bit. My screen looks really small now because I've zoomed in so much before. Okay, so the final bit that I'm going to talk about is this. Now that I've just talked for so long, Mark, that's a great question. We offer training, kind of. So in line with what I mentioned before, the best place I believe personally to learn is through peer-to-peer interaction. If someone's doing a calibration for the first ever time, and if it's in that September, October kind of time, which we call kind of the practice calibration, that calibration is really there to do forecasting for the future quarter. It's also a period of time where we do make changes ad hoc, but generally the majority of the changes will happen either in that first quarter or in that big chunky middle piece. Sometimes things will happen in the final quarter. But if you're a new manager, that usually is your first calibration you do alone. Before that, you'll have somebody else more senior than you kind of be in all those calibrations with you and kind of help you through that process. And that will be the first one that we say, like, great, you're free to just run this calibration your own way. And having that person be able to have the space to just try and do it themselves is really beneficial. But also that kind of third calibration that happens later in the year, it doesn't have any absolute outcomes, right? It doesn't lock anyone into anything. It doesn't force some kind of salary change, whereas Q1 does. So it gives every manager a chance to kind of run through it one time and say, okay, this is how I do things differently. I had my director of finance and ops who I did first round calibration with her. And then we had this whole big year where she didn't do any calibrations in her team. And then she had her one she ran by herself. And then when she got to the third calibration the next year after, she was like, oh my God, there's all these things I've already, like, the way that I write my feedback's completely changed. I'm ready to go into this, right? So she needed that amount of time, but you really need to kind of do it yourself, because being put in the hot seat and ask questions about your own feedback, that's when you learn, like, oh, that sentence wasn't clear, if that makes sense. Okay, great. So part 3. So you've done your beautiful calibration. You've had all your meetings. You've made this beautiful framework and everyone understands what good performance looks like and how to evidence it. That's amazing. It's a lot of hard work, absolutely. But I will say it's kind of the easy work, which is my hot take. The easy work is the beautiful cerebral conversations you can have as a team about what performance looks like and how to have conversations about growth. That stuff it's not the time that people are going to be, I think, the most critical of the work that you're doing. That is when you actually start turning those numbers in that grid into numbers in their paycheck. That's when all of a sudden it requires you to actually do something that's irreversible. So having a conversation with somebody about performance, of course, it's in some ways time is not irreversible, right? But you can say something to someone in a performance conversation, and then a couple of weeks later say you've really improved. Let's talk about what happened a couple of weeks ago, and like realize that it's water under the bridge. You can't do that when you're telling someone they're not going to get a pay rise. Like, that hurts someone's pay for a certain period of time once you're starting to back pay them. The other thing as well is, because it actually is affecting someone's pay, the logic behind those numbers are really important, and people will scrutinize it. And if you're sending this out to a team of 250 people, all 250 eyes will be looking at that number, asking why. Why was this 500 pounds instead of 5,000 pounds? Whatever it may be, right? The other thing is, everyone in your executive team needs to agree about the process that you've gone through, because your executive team are ultimately the ones that are signing off this big amount of money that you're planning on spending this quarter of this year. And all of your managers need to understand it, because they're the ones that are going to have those conversations with the people that are getting the changes, right? There's a lot of complexity there. And then finally, it will actually touch your company's bottom line in a really meaningful way. Compensation changes will be, over the course of the year, generally hundreds of thousands of dollars added to your P&L. And if you aren't a very good forecasting business, which a lot of companies, fair enough, aren't, they're not great at forecasting, startups particularly, that can be a really stressful thing to have happen. So one of the examples I talked through in my blog was this situation we had at a previous company I worked at, where everybody's salary changes happened annually on their anniversary, which is, I'm sure, not an uncommon thing. I've heard of multiple other companies doing the same thing, right? When your year anniversary rolls around, your manager sits with you, gives you a performance review, gives you a pay change, honky dory, you move on to the next year. Now, one of the things I observed looking at that data there was, if you had a pay rise in Q1 versus Q4, your pay rise would be 13% higher in Q1. And the reason for that, my hypothesis at least, which ended up being, I think, fairly proven, was that in Q1, everyone had these fresh new budgets, right? You've got this brand new year. Your financial controller said, yeah, you're welcome to spend this much money on whatever you need to spend it on. You're feeling optimistic. You've just come out of Christmas. Maybe your numbers are looking a little bit better because you've just set your goals and you're not off track yet. So of course, salaries are going to be risen a little more. We're not talking huge amounts, right? 13% on a $1,000 or $2,000 pay rise is not gigantic, but it is kind of a scary stat when those things start compounding. And in Q4, things are changing, right? The year's gone through. Maybe we've missed track on a couple of goals. Maybe budgets have shrunk a little. Maybe we've had to claw back some hiring. All of a sudden, managers are slightly less bullish about the changes they want to give to their team. They're still trying really hard to be unbiased, but that bias is never going to be able to completely go away, because they're not calibrating anything against anything. They're just giving pay changes based on how they're feeling that month in that conversation. And one of the I guess, like, ideas or criticisms, or I don't know how to explain what this was, but like, someone I had a lot of conversations about this finding back in the day. Like, what should I do with this, right? And a lot of people said the best way to fix this is just have once a year, everyone in your entire company gets a pay change at the same time. So in May, everyone gets a pay change at the same time. Everyone's performance is based at the same like 12-month period up until that date, and you roll it out, and then that's it. That's the end. It never really sat well with me, that idea, because I think two things is, like, I'm a very intense person, probably, as you can tell on this call slightly. I really like the idea of, like, being able to constantly be having those conversations personally. And I know I'm not everyone, but I know there are a lot of really high performing people that really want to be constantly in dialogue about their role and their level and where they're at. And a year is a bloody long time. Like, especially these days, like, a lot of people don't even want to sign a lease for a year, let alone be locked into like a specific job level for a whole year when you want to grow and change, right? So there's this progress at dazzling rates thing. And the other thing is, I think it's just a little unfair. Like, if someone's just luckily launched a really big project in Q1, then they're going to be up for a great big promotion. But that means someone else who's planning on launching something in September maybe won't. And what that ends up causing is these funny little behavioral lumps. People start learning, okay, well, I'm better off doing my project in Q1 than I am doing it in Q3. Because if I do it in Q3, then I'm not going to get any kind of recognition for it for another 6 months. So there's all of these kinds of things that go into it. And what I kind of realized is that the problem with this really was more about a forecasting thing than it was about a process thing. So one of the questions I think we've been asked here is about Q1's more for forecasting. So Q4 is for forecasting. What we do, we do a dry run calibration. We put all the data in, we do a calibration full end to end, just like we would all the time, right? Everyone goes in with their evidence, everyone puts their data in, everyone makes sure they have this calibration discussion, and we do it. It's the first time a lot of managers do it. Like, if you're a new manager or you've just been promoted, you'll do your first calibration. But the outcomes of that calibration aren't immediately taken into pay changes. That happens in Q1. But in Q4, what we do is we build a budget forecasting sheet. So what I do now, this is like a lot of really ugly templates. I'm sorry about this, but this is just where my head is at. I build this hideous sheet where everyone in the team gets given the same as you would in any kind of performance calibration, a position. It gives you an overall grid position. If we remember from the beginning of this conversation, you get given a grid position, and then you get given a change, right? That change is a percentage-based change. That then gives you a salary. It pro-ratas it if you've been with the team or you've recently had a change. And then it gives you a forecast, blah, 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 breaks it down, right? So what that then tells us is, okay, if all of these changes happen according to this calibration, there are no further changes, next calibration, the exact same outcomes happen again, you're going to have to spend $114,825 to give people those changes, right? It gives us the ability to both give like a bit of a range of tolerance and say, like, okay, well, in that case, maybe if our budget's actually 100,000, maybe we can't give 7% to our threes. Maybe we can only give 5%, 6%, right? Or if we're like, actually, wow, our budget was actually $250,000 last year. This is really under budget. Well, let's go a bit harder. Let's like make sure everyone that's meeting expectations gets 3%, right? So we really start adjusting with those things and playing with those things. I also have the opportunity there to add duplicate lines. So if I know, for example, people that are between level 1 and 3 are more likely to have 2 changes throughout a year, I'll duplicate their line and make sure there's space for them to have that. And we forecast that just in case that happens with them. And we also put some space in for really high performing people to get promoted. And we kind of duplicate their line just in case that happens. So that we're able to kind of forecast, okay, well, in our practice run calibration in Q4, we had some really strong performers who were just on the cusp of a promotion. We've made space in our budget to make sure they can get promoted next year. We had a few people that we know kind of have had 1 or 2 changes a year, not just the standard one. Let's make sure that we've duplicated a couple of people at those lower levels, make sure that's all baked in there. And then what this gives us is a bunch of percentages we can wiggle around and say, cool. So based on this kind of forecasting of Q4 calibrations, we think we're going to spend around $114,000 this year. I give this number to finance. Finance goes away. Finance looks us into all of our forecasts, and then we crack on for the year, right? Then we get into Q1. We do our proper calibration. And this is the place where we also bake in all of our market changes. So market changes are not the same as performance changes. It's important for us to distinguish these two things. We get all of our compensation data from the Economic Research Institute, ERI, and every single year in the first quarter of the year, and sometimes twice a year, depending on how crazy the economy is, which every year the last few years has been crazy, we will go through and actually update all of those compensation bands. So we check all of the codes are right. We just double check all of the compensation bands are right. We change everything in there. And then in our forecasting in Q4, it will generally tell us if someone's starting to slip out of those bands, and we make sure we just bump them up. So that is a process that, again, happens in Q1 as well. Then what we do is we just build a little simple, I talk about inflation here. We don't give inflation-based changes. Basically, inflation, the reason we don't do this is because wages inflate based on wage inflation. So marketing may, I mean, a good example is maybe in 2016, DevOps engineers were like, in the wage inflation for them was absolutely insane. DevOps engineers went from maybe having like £65,000 a year salary for like junior or mid-level, all of a sudden to like 90,000, right, over like a couple of months. That inflation didn't affect every single role the same. Like, it just affected DevOps engineers. The same is true when it comes to inflation on other wages, right? The price of eggs and gas and those kinds of things don't split out across everybody's role equally. But I believe that companies do have an ethical requirement to address the fact that your employees should be able to afford the cost of living. That doesn't necessarily mean their wages should be increasing, but it definitely does mean that you should be addressing how to give them once off or quarterly off cost of living adjustments when there is periods of financial distress or really high inflation, and then wait and see how wage inflation bakes out. And that's something that we have done at Whereby. We've done multiple £400 pay period cost of living adjustments to make sure that those teams that weren't seeing huge wage inflations weren't also suffering financial distress during those periods, and that they were still taken care of. So great. We break it down to a little algorithm. Like I just said, this is the way that it works in our spreadsheet. It gives everybody a pay change on top of the pay change they would get within their market adjustment. So everyone is first adjusted based on their new market rate. So say here we have a software engineer level 2, they're on 100 grand. They then, there's a market adjustment into the compensation calculator. It says, well, every software engineer should be on $3,000 now. Great, we move them there. And then also there is a performance-based change because they're actually also entitled to a 5% increase based on their calibration position. Their increase would then go up 5,150. So this then brings them up to the new total of 108,150 USD. So that would be their increase. We would break all that down in a little letter for them, explain it. We actually published the whole algorithm for everyone in our company to be able to see it. So everyone can understand exactly dollar for dollar where those pay changes have come from and how it's affected them. Now, there's one little slight note on here that I will mention, which is like, what if something goes wrong? So these things I'm describing to you all sound like everything's really smooth, which sometimes it is. Most of the time I would say it is. But there have been multiple times recently where the forecast that I have done in Q4 has been right in Q4. And then when I get to Q1, the whole world has gone skew-if, and all of a sudden my forecast looks insane. So the kind of beauty of actually doing the forecast is you still have some control over what happens throughout the year, right? I'm not a big fan of canceling all pay changes because a company has done a poor job forecasting. I think pay changes are really important to people, and particularly for performance. So one of the things that happened a couple of years ago was, and I'm sure many people will remember here, during that period of like the Great Resignation, the big quit was happening. We saw some 25% changes in pay for market rates. Engineering was particularly affected in the UK. There were just massive changes. I think at this point, Facebook and Google were giving like 20% raises across the board to some of their engineering teams. It was just absolutely insane, right? So when we actually got that market data back, we applied our algorithm across everybody, and we saw some people getting like 25% pay changes. Some people getting more than 25%. I think 27, 28% were some of our highest pay changes. Now, that's insane. It's really high pay changes, but the algorithm was the algorithm, right? But no, of course, that's silly, because then you've got some people who are really high performers in sales, for example, who are only seeing maybe like a 7, 8, or 9% pay change. And what that also meant was we would then have to start dampening the pay changes that we saw for across the entire board, because our budget then started shrinking because it was being eaten up so much by market changes, which we didn't expect to be as high as they were. So what we decided to do was we capped total changes at 20% and said, if your total change is already 20%, we can't give you above that this year, which is already a massive pay change. I think a lot of people were still very happy with that 20% change. But the other thing is we also said, if you're meeting expectations in engineering and product, you won't receive any pay change according to performance. But you will get a pay change for market changes, of course, because the inflation, the wage inflation has gone up so significantly that you will get a pay change, but it just won't be around your performance. But everyone else in the business will get a pay change if they meet expectations. Of course, it's not going to be gigantic. Met expectations, I think, was like 3% or 2%. But everyone in the team that meets expectations will get a pay change, except for product engineering, who will get a market change. We broke all of that down. We explained everything. I did a Q&A and talked about it. Everybody seems like fairly agreeable with how we decided to go about it that year. And we still managed to meet all of our budgets for the year in terms of our pay changes all the way through to the end of the year, when we still had a couple of little adjustments into Q4. So although it didn't go smoothly and it had required some kind of head scratching from us and thinking how we're going to bend and manipulate this process to make sure it works for everybody, the pre-work we had done really set us up for success in understanding what we needed to do next. Gosh, I've been talking a lot. I think I'm done now. So I appreciate everybody's patience with me. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
That was amazing. I feel like I was just a sponge here. I was like, I'm going to go back and rewatch and re-listen to this. But it was
you have to say that, Kelly. If you didn't say that, I'd be very upset.
I thought it was really interesting, that point though, around, even when you mentioned around the DevOps salaries, because I think working in recruitment and TA, there was also a point where those salaries skyrocketed, and obviously we're in a very different market at the moment. But yeah, we do have a few moments if anyone does have any questions that you want to share with us. While we wait for any questions to come through, what I'm just going to do is pop up the little link for Hire below if anyone is not already a lovely member of our community. Like I said, we're a Slack group, over 10,000 people globally, internal TA and HR folks. So we always love to continue these webinar conversations over in the group as well. And we also do in-person events, which it's great to be back actually seeing people face to face. So we've got some dinners coming up in August. How are we in August already? For leaders within TA and HR as well. So do pop over and join us if you're not already a member. Oh, I can hear some lovely New York sirens in the background. And then I also just wanted to share that next week, because we do these lovely webinars every week, we've got a webinar next week with Chris Marty. And this is all around looking at the landscape of TA if you're working in or interested in working in venture capital as well. So that will be same time, same place if you wanted to come and join us. We've just got some comments coming in, Jessie. Lots of claps. I love how I have to do the movement. Lots of claps, lots of thank yous. Really interesting, illuminating. People saying they've loved that. So it feels like people have been hopefully taking up and taking in lots of insight. We've got a comment from Megan saying, could listen to you talk for hours. Thank you for this. So lots of positive.
Thank you, everybody.
It's amazing considering as well. I know you've been feeling under the weather, but like you could not tell from that webinar. It was amazing, really, really insightful.
Thank you.
Got a comment from Mark saying lots to take in, really interesting. But yeah, I mean, if anyone does have any other questions, please do come and post them within Hire. Myself and Jessie are obviously in the channel, in the Slack community, so we'll be able to follow up. And this recording will be available. It's going to go on as a replay as well, so that you can listen at any point. But we are pretty much at time now. So Jessie, thank you so much for joining us.
I really appreciate you having me today.
It's been great. And like I said, you were a highly requested speaker from the group. So we've been really honored to have you join us. And thank you everyone for tuning in and watching. And hopefully we will see you all next week. See you later, everyone.
See you then. Bye.
Bye.